So I'm now going to share my screen with you and show you some things. I'm going to start with a little video. The video is a nice sort of beginning point, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. So one thing about this video that's worth noting is that it's running backwards. It's not going in the front direction, the front order, it's running in a backwards order. So sometimes people think that I'm somehow joining or stitching this work together, that I have some sort of device in my hand that is some sort of miniature sewing machine. Actually, it's a pair of scissors. I'm cutting it apart, and because the video is running backwards, it makes it look as if I'm making it. I'm actually unmaking it. And the reason for this is that when I go to different places, I sometimes do different types of lectures. Sometimes I'll make a garment from start to finish so the students can see the evolution of the garment step by step. But sometimes I also go to places where we have to give quicker lectures, or maybe they don't have sewing facilities. So by showing a dissection, by reverse engineering it, people can see the garment taken apart rather than made. And it's a very useful way of showing sometimes different ways of communicating how the process of construction works, either by constructing it, sewing step by step, or the opposite, deconstructing it, taking it apart. And all these garments, each one of these have been made for a particular person in a particular place for a particular class, and they get signed and dated and named after that person. Every garment is unique to the person. And also this piece of music playing is rather important, right? The piece of music was actually the last band that Marie and I went to see before the lockdown was in London, in a place called Camden, in the Electric Ballroom. And it was a band called the Murder Capital. And they're a band from Dublin in Ireland, and they were a band that we love very much, and the music's become more significant to us because it was the last piece of music, or the last musicians we saw playing live. And we will drop their name into the chat if you want. The name of this piece of music is called Slow Dance. We will return to this little shadow that was on the ground there, that was at the very end of this. There's a little shadow, piece of fabric on the ground that the model stands against, and this is actually the outline of Marie's body that I drew around to use it as a tool to create my own measure for making the garments that the model is wearing, because when I made this garment, Marie wasn't with me, and so we have, both of us have measures of each other's bodies that we will use in each other's absence to create garments from, and to use them like tape measures. And I'll talk more about this a little bit later. So I'm going to show you a little visual presentation, a little PowerPoint called Marie, Julian and Marie, to sort of introduce us, to introduce you to our work and to talk about how we work together and why we work in this way and how we work in this changed way at this time of lockdown. I'm from the UK. Marie is from Tbilisi in Georgia. Here's our two places. So I'm currently in Chichester on the left-hand side, this little cathedral town. It's a city, but it's a very small city. And Marie is in Tbilisi in Georgia. Georgia's between sort of Turkey and Russia in the Caucasus Mountains. This is where we currently are. We're not together because we're from different countries, but we're partners in life, and we're partners in creativity. So we've been separated by this these COVID lockdown events, and we've had to sort of adapt and change and find ways to work together and to teach together that allows us to to continue our work and to continue reaching out, because a lot of our work is about going to places and to meeting people and working with them and creating work in place. And of course, at that time, that can't happen. We had lots of gigs planned around the world in different places at the beginning of the lockdown, and they just all collapsed one by one by one. The whole sort of business side of that just evaporated, and it was a time of loss, but also a time of thinking, well, what do we do next? What do we do instead? I've got a job where I teach at the Royal College of Art early in the week, from Monday to Wednesday. The rest of the week I'd normally be finding ways to travel places to teach, and that just can't happen in this time. So to try and, rather than sort of like lick our wounds and feel bad about that, we just thought, well, let's just create an opportunity on a Friday where we can engage with students around the world in different situations, because everyone is experiencing these times differently depending on where they are. Some people are coming out of lockdowns and some people are still within them, but there will be a long period of time of difference, and that will sort of resonate through the world. And we kind of want to try and find ways to talk to students in this time to show them how we work and how they can maybe find ways to work that can be creative and experimental, that work for you. They're not you trying to do anything other than grows on your own creativity. It's not about you trying to learn something very hard or very different. It's about you just simply having a new opportunity, and giving people that opportunity is very important to us and very important to us as teachers. We'll talk a little bit about our practice and some of the places we work in. This is the actual room I'm currently sat in now is my dad's house in Chichester. He's 75 years old, and I'm self-isolated in his place, and we're also sort of slightly divided within this space because he'd had earlier this year a heart operation and was recovering from a heart valve operation, and so he's actually been doing very, very well in this time and recovering. And I'm in a very little room that was his little office, and it's now become my bedroom, my school, my kind of studio. And the first thing I did in this space was start to put things on the wall. And once I'd arranged the furniture and created myself a bit of floor space, I started to put things on the wall, inspiration, things that are important to me, messages, things to sort of remind me of things that I need to do. But I also put little hooks on the wall, and I put up some hangers. Now, it's very similar to this space that you see in front of you. It's a different space. This is actually a studio in Brighton when I had the liberty to move around. So I did a very similar thing there. I put up my inspiration on the wall, and I put up little hangers that are empty. And the emptiness is important. It's an absence, but it's kind of the hope that they will be filled. It's an intention to fill them with garments. So I did the same thing in the room I'm in now. I put up little hangers that are empty, and I've now started to put them up on the wall and start to create them. In this space, the one that was in Brighton, I gathered all this inspiration and I put it onto a piece of paper, a big piece of pattern cutting paper, and I'd have library books and magazine cuttings, colours I find, things that catch my eye, and I start to sellotape or to glue them onto this sheet, and it creates a single page sketchbook. Often we have sketchbooks that might be digital or they might be real scrapbooks. But when you turn the page of a scrapbook, you often have to then lose what was there previously. By turning the page, you close that page, and you have to therefore remember what was there. I like to create a single page scrapbook so that I can look at the whole thing, and I can then reference from one corner to the next, from one left-hand side to right, and vice versa, from up to down. And it allows me to sort of look across it. And on there is just lots and lots and lots of things that catch my eye. And when I gather this research, I often don't know what it's for. You know, what is the purpose of this research? Why is it, what's it mean? And actually, I don't know. I just put it together and gather it and start to group it. And by grouping it, I group colours, I group things of importance that seem to sit together. And I didn't know that beforehand, but it just kind of happens in the moment of sifting and putting things together and finding relationships with them. So in your spaces, in your time, you may create, in however much room you have, it might be big, it might be small, a little space that you can put together things that matter to you, things that have appealed to your senses, that have caught your eye, that are meaningful to you in some way. It might be some shrine of some kind that you begin to create that has important key things, key people, key moments that you want to remember. And I often tend to react to them initially through colour. I will draw colour from them. I'll be very specific about colour. Colour is a very emotional thing. It matters. It's different for all of us how we feel about colour from one season to the next, from one time to the next. We will change our attitude to colour. So it's sometimes interesting to think, what is our colour palette of now? If we look at the things we gather, things that catch our eye and our attention, if we try to match those colours, then it gives us this palette that represents us. And it's a good thing at the starting point of any textile or fashion or art project, is to try and think, what is the colour of that project before we begin to think about its form. I then often will, when I have the liberty to move around, I would then take colour chips of these colours that I've gathered that are very specific, and I'll then start to find them in the world. I'll go out and try and locate these materials or dye them, create those colours myself. Now when I actually start working in shape and form, I often work in black and white. I reduce the palette to a very sort of minimalistic tone group, black and white, because it allows me to see high contrast and it allows me to see the movement of cloth. So when I do subtraction cutting, it's a very disorientating process of construction. The geometry of it is often what I call disorientated. That is that the left ends up on the right, the back ends up on the front ends up on the back, the inside is sometimes on the outside. There's a sort of a movement of cloth that is unexpected, and you don't quite know where things are going to go during the process of cutting and constructing. So in order to learn, using black and white is very useful to the process of cutting, so it reduces it. And sometimes when I'm working on garments, I don't make and finish everything completely as I go. I make it, and then when I get to a point where I either don't like it anymore, or I think this isn't working for me, or I've reached a point where I don't think I can go any further, I just simply stop and move on to the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one, and the next one. And then I come back to it at a point where I've gained a bit of wisdom to understand how to finish it. So not all things are made and finished in one go. They're made, it's good to sometimes move on to another thing, particularly if you've made it and you hate it. If you make it and you think, oh, it's a disaster, it hasn't worked, then rather than throw it away, keep it, but move on to something else and then something else. And that creates a distance between you and it. And perhaps in time, you might actually feel that your critical judgment changes. It may be that something that you hate right now, over time, you may grow to love something about it, or to appreciate an aspect of it that has something that has, maybe the whole thing isn't wrong, maybe just part of it is wrong. Maybe it needs something else that you haven't yet discovered before you can complete it and bring it back to life. So it's an important aspect of designing is sometimes allowing time to pass, allowing your attitudes to change, and maybe that you might fall in love with something that previously was hateful to you. So that all of these garments are like that. I didn't know they were going to look like this when I cut and constructed them. They were all just experiments. They were tests, happy accidents, and at the beginning there were no drawings to follow. I usually do my drawings during the process of construction or afterwards. So I draw not a design beforehand to follow, but I draw a still life of the object afterwards, and then I often doodle and use drawing in a slightly more physical way. So I don't do little drawings, I do big drawings. Drawings as big as a person, a big sheet of paper. Often in fashion design we use very small pieces of paper to make little apologetic designs. I like to make big, bold ones, and not to put any body in it. It's an absent person. There's no head, there's no arms, there's no legs. And I do this for a particular reason, that if there's nobody in it, then that again is a disorientated shape. You can't say what is the top and what is the bottom. So if you turn the piece of paper upside down and you view it from another angle, you look at it sideways or you look at it upside down, then maybe that drawing will suggest to you another idea to work with. It might suggest to you a dress might suddenly upside down look like a collar, or it might look like a skirt, or it might look like a detail. Or if you look at it close up, it might suggest to you an idea for a textile design, a embroidery or print. So I like to look at my drawings not as the object I'm drawing, not as if I'm drawing a dress, it's not just a dress. If you look at it from many angles or you look at it close up, then it can suggest other things too. And that's the importance of it staying empty. And I often draw it in a very messy fashion. It's very sort of quick and energetic. And when you're doing a big drawing energetically, you move your limbs a great deal. And you're not just moving your fingers and your hand and the implement, the tool that you're holding, but your whole wrist and your arm and maybe even your shoulder, if it's a big drawing, are all moving. And so you're very physically involved in the activity of drawing. And then afterwards, I sometimes do little doodles that aren't there. I'm no longer drawing what I see. I'm drawing whatever's in my mind, whatever's kind of in my body and what feels right that day. Just let my hand wander to colour it in and to complete it. Sometimes I close my eyes when I draw, and like these ones are made by with eyes closed, and they're actually just to exercise certain energies that are in your body that are maybe trapped there. So if you're going to be making garments, you're going to be doing pattern cutting. We often use very precise tools and rulers and measures. But before we get into that stage, rather than going straight into using a ruler and a sharp pencil, if you go to a table and you start working in that way, then you're going to create tensions in your shoulders and your arms as you try to concentrate and be accurate. If before all of that you close your eyes and you just draw whatever is in your body, whatever's in your mind, and you exercise this from you, then it helps you before you go and start cutting and making a garment. You'll have more fluidity in your lines, you'll have more freedom of movement, and you can maybe measure by eye a little bit more accurately. It's a little bit like if you're doing a athletic exercise, like if you're doing running or football or some athletic sport, boxing, then you would always stretch and warm up beforehand. You do a bit of yoga, you do a little bit of something that eases you into that shape. So these drawings are a kind of physical yoga for relaxing my cutting and also allowing some of these energies to sort of like permeate outwards. They get very messy often, and I love observing them close up because these lines are my body, they're representations of me, and so therefore they're all often interesting to look at. But also, I often become the paintbrush. I often get rid of the paintbrush and I paint by finger, and with my arms and with parts of my body. And this is important because it physically connects me to the medium, to the paint, which is liquid, but also to the material, which is soft. It's not always paper that I'm working onto. Often when we make garments, we design on paper, then we construct and cut patterns using paper or cardboard, and that's very different to fabric. Fabric is very fluid, very soft. It's a floppy thing, and it needs a different geometric approach. So when you connect yourself to the mediums, when you touch it, when you handle it, your brain becomes very connected to that activity, and so do your limbs, and you become more able to design it. So it's very important touching. Touching is a very important aspect of creating art and also of creating designs that are cut. And these often get quite messy for me. Now, Marie Bendeliani, I'll give you a little bit of a lowdown before Marie says a few words about her work. Marie and I first met in Tbilisi in Georgia at the State Academy of Arts there, where Marie was studying, and she actually, on the day that I came in, she was my appointed interpreter. And so she was there to interpret my class into the Georgian language, and we hadn't met, and I'm a person that I don't make notes very often, but I come out with lots and lots of information. I talk, I say what's on my mind, and it's an ongoing story that I don't write down. And Marie had to very quickly listen to this and then interpret it into the Georgian language for the class to understand. So we had to connect very quickly through communication. And this is really how our relationship has developed over time. We we talk a lot, we show each other things, we teach together, and then we find ways to reinterpret that, to translate that language, that visual language and creative language, through different making activities and through classes. And so here is Marie. I will sometimes show Marie a technique, and then she will run with it in her own wild direction. She has an amazing ability to reinterpret techniques, and to give it completely her own, take on, how it's practiced. And that's the beauty of subtraction cutting, is it's not just about one person's way of working. If you, if you approach subtraction cutting, then you will do it your way. You will do it in your own method. You make it your own. Here is Marie in the middle of a drawing. And you are feeling outwards and feeling your environment. We're all in lockdown spaces at the moment, and different.
Yeah. So this was before the lockdown. So I had more space and obviously more materials to work with. But this was a drawing that I didn't previously have in mind that I would do it a certain way. So it was very spontaneous and physical activity where I didn't have a final outcome in mind. It was just something that was very instinctive and reactive in a process. So it's both like a warm-up to then continue making something else, but it also is a process that shows when you make a garment, and then you can dress up in it and just connect with the colors and shapes and the patterns that you've cut. So when I make something, I get dressed up in it, I take pictures, then I wear it, and then I do a drawing, which is also a kind of a reference and has a similarity to the dress that I had made. So this is just a drawing that shows that feeling of and the mood that I had created for the garment, and that these garments and cutting and drawing and painting, these are all connected in like a one process. So
it's really interesting. What I like about this is
spontaneous way of making
these drawings are not. These drawings are so connected to what you're wearing. So first of all, you will make a garment, and then you will wear the garment, and then you make the drawing from the garment. So the drawing is what the garment feels like to wear. So it's a different kind of drawing that's used in fashion. It's not like the design, or it's not like the drawing that I do, like the ones afterwards, like an observation. But it's actually more of a feeling of the dress.
Yes, it's more like a reactive drawing, really.
And that, of course, changes very drastically depending on what you feel at that moment in that dress. It's a very sort of human activity of drawing.
Depends on the color and the material and the kind of like references that you've got before, and how the drawing is triggered really by the mood and the feeling in the garment. Yeah.
And it's a messy activity too, like with myself. We get very involved in the mediums, so the mediums are on our bodies and kind of become connected to us. And then what's interesting as well is sometimes we don't have all the materials we need. Like we don't have all the fabrics we need to make things. So if you're making a dress that needs sleeves, then what I love is with Marie's work, she will draw a sleeve onto her own body. So what is missing? You haven't got the fabric to complete the full thing. So you will extend it upon yourself. So you draw, not just using your body to draw with, but you use your body as a canvas to draw onto.
Yeah. So
in the absence of cloth.
It's like a really telling a story through, not also by garment making, but also with lines and drawing. So it's like one whole thing that you can somehow tell your personal and emotional story with. So I think that just follows the process all the time. But some of this work is pretty old. I wouldn't say necessarily ancient, but quite old, and some are quite newer. So as you can see on both hand side, there's drawing in the background, then there is me wearing the garment that was really experimental, no outcome in mind, and then there are paintings of myself. So it's layers and layers of paint, and most of these garments are no waste, so we use all scraps, and we kind of make sometimes not a whole garment, but it might just be a sleeve or some kind of shape, it could be a color that then could suggest a different idea.
And the drawing is, as Marie just said, it's like there's a foreground, middle ground, background. There's the body on which the drawing is. There's the garment, which is a drawing. The drawing is cut by the movement of your body on cloth when you're sort of marking the design of the dress onto it and cutting it and following it with your scissors. And then behind you is the drawing that was made whilst wearing it or in the presence of that garment. So there's different ways in which drawing are used in the representation of this garment and its creation.
And it really never ends, you know, when you make the garment and then you dress up in it, and then there is always more and more you want to do to kind of create the whole picture or the whole story. Yeah. So it's a long process, and painting is important.
So we both do have this sort of appreciation of what we call pattern painting, and that is that a lot of times when people learn pattern cutting, the actual art of constructing garments, they're given certain tools that are quite limiting. So you're given a ruler, something that's rigid. You're given a implement such as a fine pencil or a tractable pencil, and it's, you know, it's you can't be very fast with it because it will break, and also it's a very pinpointy kind of line. And we work in this way with using those implements, using great accuracy. But that accuracy can sometimes be a very great limitation of movement of our bodies, and also the idea of movement of our creativity, and also of the cloth that we're making things for, which is fluid. And so by working in fluid mediums, in liquid mediums, we're often able to be a little bit freer in our designing. So we use paint to create patterns with garment patterns. And the paintings really inform the pattern and really give us the sort of the almost like map to follow that we would then work around. And so I'll show you a few sort of like collaborative pieces that we've worked on. We often, you know, paint goes onto our skin. We like to observe that color difference between ourselves and it. It's something we like to observe a lot. We paint each other's bodies, so we will often use an imprint of ourselves onto cloth. And then having imprinted ourselves, we then cut around the garment. Because in subtraction cutting is often about removal of space. Sometimes it's removed to then be put back in again. And that's a sort of a more zero waste approach. Sometimes the removal of space joins with another hollow space, and that creates a strange sort of three-dimensional geometric shape that the body passes through. There's different uses of space, but the involvement of subtraction or cutting away means that that's a choice, that you have to remove a place. And if you're going to remove a place, it's good to remove a bit that you don't want, or that you want less. So when you've painted something with your body, to then work around that and to remove the bits that you don't need, and then that creates routes for the body to pass through. This is a piece that's made in Cuttery in Georgia that Marie and I both collaborated on, and it's a garment that's made from a painting. This too is another garment, the one I showed you in the video at the start, with a little fabric silhouette of Marie that's become a shadow, that is actually a tool or a measure, which I'll talk about a little bit later, about how we make our own tools to make garments from. In this instance, we were in Cuttery in Georgia, and we had some white, some black cotton fabric. We got some white paint, and we were asked to do an exhibition in London called The Speed of Thought. And it was an exhibition that exhibited last year, and it had lots of different artists and designers who used drawing to describe the world, or used drawing within their practice. And this was both artists and scientists, because it's something that links us all, is drawing, across disciplines. And so we were asked to be in this exhibition. So we decided that we would exhibit a dress, but we also wanted to show the process and the geometry of that dress. And so we decided to make a dress called the Pluto dress. It's named after the dwarf planet Pluto. And that planet is beyond what's called the Kuiper Belt, or the Kuiper Belt is a sort of an ice area of space beyond Neptune. And so we started drawing like almost a map of space using white paint and using our bodies to imprint onto it. And then from that, we cut holes that connect to each other. We cut 8 holes in all, each for each of the 8 planets, each to represent each of the 8 planets. And this then created the dress that's on the that was shown in the video, and that's on the right hand side. This was exhibited with the painting inside it, so the painting was hidden from view. And then during the exhibition, it was exhibited, and then we took it apart so that people could actually see live the garment dissected. Like the videos we showed you at the beginning where the garment's being reverse engineered. It allowed us to talk about how the garment is constructed. People could understand the process. It's very important to us that we teach the process and we allow it to be seen and understood. And then afterwards, the garment becomes a flat painting, so it becomes exposed. And then afterwards, we decide to put it back together again and mend it, this time with the painting facing outwards. It's about how we incorporate painting and cutting and showing our work. It's all a very experimental process. This is another garment that's based on a planet. It's called the Neptune dress. This one was painted in Berlin, and it was using blue paint. We often choose different colors, this time onto a white bedding, cotton, and it was then exhibited and made to be shown in Singapore. And this was actually the last class that Marie and I were together for.
Just before the lockdown.
Just before the lockdown, which is why Marie at the bottom is wearing a face mask, because we taught, we had to, by law, we had to wear face masks to teach in. And this was back in March time, about 65 days ago, because we've now been in lockdown for 65 days. I'll just show you a little bit of process of this dress, actually, just so you can see a bit of its construction. So here is the dress being constructed, and there you see me very briefly with a silhouette of Marie. You will loop back to that in a moment. But here I am now cutting around from an aerial perspective the back and the fronts, which are kind of like joined by a continuous line into a piece of cloth that we've painted. And these choices of lines that I'm cutting are working around the painting we created. So I'm responding to the painting. And because Marie's not there, I often will use Marie's body shadow as almost like ruler or tape measure to figure out distances, to figure out choices of where things will be cut. So then I know that it will have some relationship with her body during its construction process. And this is the piece that was taken and shown in Singapore. So we've been working on this project that's ongoing. We call it Puffs in Isolation, and it kind of began from at Christmas time in December. We went to Athens and we stayed there a short while, and I showed Marie this technique that I developed. I first showed it in my very first collection. When I left college, when I left the Royal College of Art where I studied menswear, I worked for a while, and then I set up my own brand, and that label was called Nothing Nothing. And it's a nice empty title for a label, and it launched in 1999, and the first collection was September 1999, and that collection was Spring Summer 00, the first collection of the new millennium, the year 2000. And I made a whole series of very experimental subtraction cut garments, and one of them, or a few of them, use this thing called puffs, and these are like corona-like shapes that extrude and extend through the surface. They kind of like explode through the surface, and they have negative spaces inside them. And so I showed this picture to Marie that I'd drawn back then, and she wanted to know how it was made. So I demonstrated it to her. We didn't have a sewing machine, so we just did it by hand stitching. I cut some fabric up and I showed her how to do it. And then Marie, being a very creative person, just ran with it and just started to do it in her own way. So these are now examples of Marie's puff experiments.
Just toiles, no
toiles.
color, no specific material,
Yeah.
just experimenting. When you're shown a technique, how much you can then push it and how far that you can take it. Because when you show a one technique, then you kind of have to find a new ways of making that work. So
they use often all sorts of materials as well. All sorts of scraps, little pieces. It's
transparent, knitted, all sorts of materials.
It's very useful for zero waste, for using up any discarded bits that we have. So that's why we try to keep everything, because we never know what something might become. Anything that we remove or subtract, that is a second problem to solve as to what it then becomes within the garment we make, or within the next garment that follows. And these are sort of different times, and these are fairly recent ones, and there's different, they're made at different, we're both practicing this now, so it's very current work. This is work that Marie's making in her space where she is, and I'm making it in my space. And one thing that we did before the lockdown, we were very lucky. Marie was able to come to London for a bit. We were able to go around the country and teach in different places. and I was able to, Marie was able to meet my family, and we were also able to gather fabrics together. We went to see bands and music play, like the Murder Capital, who were playing in the very first video we showed. So we were able to do some things together. And one important thing we were able to do together, we was just rather lucky, was that we were able to gather some fabrics. And we went to a place called Deptford, and they have an amazing market there that sells Ankara waxed cottons. And Ankara waxed cottons are often used in various countries in the continent of Africa. And amazingly beautiful fabrics to work in. They're all so unique and fascinating, and they have
energetic and vibrant,
really vibrant colours and patterns, and often quite bonkers and strange, some of those geometric patterns. And when you put them together, they really begin to talk and collide and create little sort of stories together. And so we divided the fabric we gathered in half. So I have half of the fabric and Marie has half. And so we've both been making almost like a collection that's divided by geography. We're not in the same place, but we are working in the same materials, and we're kind of involving certain geometric techniques that we are kind of pushing and playing with in our own directions. And it becomes a kind of a collection that hasn't been yet brought together. We've not been able to sort of yet bring it together into any form of exhibition, but we are documenting it and recording it on our bodies and on on hangers and in close-up detail. They look a little bit like little sort of Amazonian lizards or frogs, or subaquatic subterranean creatures, quite exotic in their sort of palette. So these materials are sort of some sort of close-ups that you can see of it, and because we put these on our wall, so the space I'm in now was empty didn't have anything on the wall, and now it's kind of filled with lots and lots of colours and materials, and it's the same with Marie. And so sometimes when we take pictures of our walls, we sometimes can often forget whose is whose and what's who is this yours or is this my wall I'm looking at now. It becomes like joined, and that's a very important thing at this time of lockdown, is that we feel closer, we feel locked in the same activity of pursuits. We're trying to aim towards something. We might be teaching, we might be trying to sort of strive towards that, and we might also be collaborating and making things and trying to make sense of those activities and invent new ideas. And that's not everything always goes right. Things go wrong in that process, and we share our accidents with each other and often enjoy them. We often see things we make that are actually rather wild and intriguing, and a mistake worth making. Actually, this little dress that's on the far right hand side, is it the right hand side? No, far left hand side. These little stripes, it's actually hanging on the wall behind me. When I put my camera back on, you'll see it. This dress was actually made at Soft in Pune, so it was actually made in your city, and very important little dress that I then cut for Marie to wear in London, and we went to London Fashion Week in it, and
got photographed.
Got photographed, at side shows. So they're interesting memories that are made through clothes. That's the importance of clothes, is that they contain memories. They contain memories of making, but they contain memories of wearing too, and in this time of lockdown, it's very important to think, who are we making these things for? Who are we making garments for? Who are we making textiles for? Who do we want to wear them? Who do we miss? Who do we wish to wear them? When I'm making garments, there's an absence within it, and they're made for Marie. They're made for Marie to wear because she's the person I miss. And so that absence is hopeful. It means that one day I know that Marie will be in these garments, and I'll see what they look like, finally on her. And that is something that is important to consider if you're designing, is like, who do you really want to be in these garments now? The world's changing in terms of who our customers are, who our markets are. There's many things that are going to change. And I think one important change can be made is we can begin to be more realistic about who we would hope these garments be worn for and what our connection is to that. And, can we make garments that honour other people and honour the memory of those people, our heroes. These are lots of things that are like all the little, subtractions that are then scattered across my floor. It looks like some sort of crazy game of Twister that we might play, because Marie in the morning, we do yoga in the morning, and then we do dancing, and we all share a little video of dancing because it's quite an uplifting way of starting the day. And this looks like my little sort of dance floor that I'm creating to do some sort of crazy Twister on. These pieces actually become the puffs, the corona shapes that then puff out or extrude through the garment. So they get reused again. this is the space I'm actually working in now. It's quite a small space for me to work in, and some of the garments I construct are bigger than the space I'm working in. So, I can't just put the fabric out cleanly. I have to work in it in a quite crumpled up way. And that's just the nature of this space, and it therefore changes the way I practice. And it's not a limitation to it. It's often I start to make garments actually that are bigger than this space because I want to escape it. I want to feel that I'm getting out of this claustrophobia that I feel sometimes in this place. It's odd, going to sleep. I have a little next to me. I've got a little camp bed where I'm talking to you now from. I teach from this room. I cut in this room, and I sleep in this room. And often I wake up and I look at these garments surrounding me. They're looking down on me, and they become my friends. And they're the garments that Marie will be in. So there's a connection to her in them. But it does sometimes. All of these things do continue into my dream world and into my sleep patterns. I'm often having Zoom meetings in my sleep. It's an anxious activity that sometimes continues into my restfulness. So we have to find ways, therefore, to ease ourselves and our anxieties by doing something that is like, say, for example, doing yoga in the morning and then doing some dancing, and then we start our day. That's a lovely beginnings. And so doing some wild drawing and then doing some cutting, they're things that ease the activities of creating. And so we have to think about in our own lives what activities can make our creativity easier to do, more connected to those we love and the places we maybe want to reach. This is a garment, a puff dress that we made directly after coming back from a class in Singapore in March where we had to evacuate home. I'll talk about that in a moment. We made this puff dress. And Marie made one, a black and white one. I made a yellow and black stripe one. And those garments, I'll just show you a little version of their construction. They were constructed in this kind of way. Here's it being constructed. So it's made from triangles and circles is what the coronas, the puffs are made from. But everything I remove from the cloth, everything I construct from the cloth, as I'm constructing the shape for the garment, the actual form of the torso, that's a technique called tunnel technique, and you can find that in the book if you download it. But then everything that's removed then becomes put back into the garment. So there's actually 26 puffs put back into the garment because 26 holes were removed in the making of that garment. So it becomes a zero waste piece in its construction. And I'll just show you also, seeing as then what happens after that process. I'll just start this one off and this one together so you can see them. And when we construct and make things, when we are making garments, they have a sense of movement within them. A garment that you make, if you make a coat, then when you put that coat on in front of a mirror, you'll stand in a certain way and you'll have a certain posture, especially if that coat has got volume. If you put on a very tight fitted jacket, then when you put that on, you'll maybe feel more sort of like strong in the shoulders and more upright. Perhaps it will change your posture. You may also feel more professional, perhaps. It depends whether you think of a jacket as being a kind of a professional workwear item. If you put on a nice sort of fluid sari type shape, then that might give you movement within your body that wasn't there before you put it on. So we find this when we make garments a lot, that by putting on certain garments, they change our movements and they change our attitudes. And particularly if you're looking at yourself in a mirror or on a camera, because you begin to move in accordance to that garment that you put on. So when we made our dresses, we danced in it. We kind of like put some movement. And of course, we were dancing to music. I'll put some of that music on now. And so we respond to music. We kind of like feel it, and the garment makes us feel it in a different way. And these are very important things to observe when you are a garment maker or a textile designer, is what does the garment give you in terms of freedom of movement and expression of movement? And these, we don't know unless we try. And so we don't take ourselves seriously when we do this. We just jump into it. And we do this quite often in the garments we make and construct and cut. They're kind of like throwing us into a new form of activity, of movement, which we share together. And by sharing it, it's almost like a double dare. By Marie dancing, me dancing, we dance more extravagantly, we dance more intriguingly, we learn from each other. And there's a mirroring going on in that activity too, not just in the dresses, but in the wearing and in the movements.
And the music.
Yeah. Music is very, very important to us in our in our work, because music is a very sensory activity. It really, really inspires and sort of connects us to, certain ways of working and being. So it's a very important thing to consider in our kind of collaborative work too. So it's something that you'll see at certain parts in our work. We'll always refer back to music. This is recently the most recent piece we've been making, or together at least. We decided to cut up black and white cottons and just start to sort of like splice them together. And first of all, we create this sort of like very stripy base that's a bit like a
Yeah.
duvet shape.
So we make our
And we
own
start to,
textile
yeah, exactly.
in
Make
a
a sort
way
of a make a
as well.
make a sort of a textile that is instead of a printed stripe, a constructed stripe. And then we start to find ways to form it around the body and add puffs and extrusions onto it. And that's a very recent garment that we've been making. So there's this thing called every garment is a person, and that is that if we use yourself as a measure, then your body is in the garment. We will use our hands as tools for measuring our finger widths, our hand spans, our arm lengths, and this is important in forming the garment. But also, if we're making a garment for another person, then we use their body in that process too. We'll use lots of references to them, and a lot of them are not numerical measurements or sizing scales. Everyone is very unique in their body shape, and it's sometimes important to sort of meditate upon that. So this person sat at the piano here is a man called Andrew Poppy. And Andrew Poppy is a rather renowned classical composer. He makes very wonderful modern classical music, and he sings, he plays guitar, he plays the piano, he works in electronic music, and he creates very, very intriguing pieces of compositions. And I first met him or encountered his music when I was at college. I was studying my MA in menswear at the Royal College of Art, and I'd started making videos early on in my degree. Videos were always part of my practice. I make videos to explore movement, but also process, to document the making of things, the timeline of making it. And also you can transport people to different places and locations. And you can also use use music as a soundtrack. And music suddenly, if you make a video and then you put a soundtrack underneath it, the sound and the movements connect together, and they kind of like sync in new ways. And so I was always very intrigued by this. So when I was at the Royal College, I made a series of suits, menswear suits, and I was going to make a video of my brother wearing them on a beach. And having made this video, I then needed a soundtrack for it. So I had a piece of music that I loved by Andrew Poppy, and so I wrote to his music label asking him, can I have permission to use your music in my video? And so then suddenly Andrew writes back to me in person saying, let's meet for a coffee. I'm interested in this. And so I didn't expect to ever be connected to the artist himself. So sometimes it's interesting, reach out, and sometimes you might connect to somebody. They might, you might actually get a reply, and you might actually get to the person. Particularly if you write by hand, a handwritten letter, not an email. Emails never reach anyone, but a handwritten message or package might. And so by writing to Andrew, we got in touch, and he then, we became friends. He let me use his music in the video I was making. But then later on, he also played the piano live at my very first show at London Fashion Week in September 1999, the first season of Spring Summer 2000, and he played the music to that in this wonderful big gallery space called the Atlantis Gallery in Brick Lane in London. And it was a very beautiful experience having somebody play unique music live so that people could see it performed. And it connected very much with the clothes of that time. Now then what happened is we kind of got on with our lives, and we kept connected through social networking, through Facebook and through Instagram and things like that. And but we didn't actually get to see each other very often. We did our activities. We felt connected digitally, but we didn't actually meet up. And then about 10 years passed, and Andrew then gets back in touch with me saying that he's releasing an album of songs called Horse Songs. Horse being, if you shout very loud, you might become hoarse in your throat. Songs that he sings against some wonderful music backdrops, and that he's, these compositions he's created that are very intricate and unique. And he wants 11 artists to make 11 videos, one for each of the songs he's written. And would I be interested in making a video for his album? So I'm like, yeah, of course, that's a fascinating thing to do. And if I'm going to do that, I'm going to make for you something to wear in that video. And maybe that will be the starting point for me. How do I make a video? I'll make a garment to wear in the video. So if I'm going to do that, I have to come and measure you. So this is a picture I took at Andrew's house. He's got long white flowing hair. I think he's about 65 years of age, and a very youthful man and very creative man. And I decided to take some measures from his body, but to take them from his musical reach. So the reach of his hand, when he extends his hand out into an octave, it is a measure. And I want to document that by drawing around that distance. When he puts his hands out into a certain posture when he plays the piano, I want to try and get a sense of that when I am drawing around him. So I lay him on the ground and I draw around his body. When he holds a guitar in a certain position, that's a certain posture. When he has his hair down when he plays, then the movement of his head when his hair is down is a certain posture that he holds in his body. And that, I'm sure, continues into his music, and will certainly, if he wears a garment, continue into the garment. So by taking measures of his body that incorporates these unique postures and reaches, musical reaches, then I can make a garment that tries to capture some of these. So what I make is, on the left hand side is a robot of Andrew, a paper version of Andrew with his hair laid out, so that I can use this to make a garment from. And it has a cross section of him, and it has his fingers, and it has his outward reach of his hands, and it also has his hair outlined as it was laid down when he was laying down on the floor. And then the next thing I do is I cut this hole into a piece of cloth. Now, people who know something about subtraction cutting will sometimes think that it's something to do with holes. And some people might think it's just simply to do with circular holes, because when I first start teaching techniques, particularly one technique called tunnel technique, it involves circular holes. But there are many more complex shaped holes that we use in subtraction cutting, and this is a particularly complex one. This is an Andrew Poppy shaped hole, including his fingers, including the flow around his hair, the hair, and it's a very elaborate hole cut into 5 meters of poppy red material, because I wanted to use red because his name to me always signals the color red, and I also thought that his hair would offset very nicely with that color, the white with the red. And from there, the first act of creativity is to cut a hole, and then the second act, having cut the hole, is to mend that hole. So if you make a hole that's circular, I'm just jumping back one slide. If you make a hole that's circular, then if you were to take one edge of that hole to the other edge and start to mend it in one direction and then in the other direction, you'd end up with a half moon shaped scar. You can do exactly the same with an Andrew Poppy shaped hole. If you take his shoulder and you join it onto another edge and you start to seal it closed in one direction and then seal it closed in the other direction, then you will end up with a very elaborate shaped scar. And this here is an Andrew Poppy shaped scar in the process of being mended. And it took a long time to stitch it closed, to hand stitch it, and to machine stitch it. And very eventually, once it's been closed, it makes this very elaborate shape. And I couldn't have known this shape beforehand. It was a shape that had to be made during the process of construction. So you can't design it beforehand in any drawn sense. You know, you can't make a little drawing of a design and say, there's my design. This way of subtraction cutting is a form of designing through making. You know what the design is at the end of the process, not the beginning of the process. And you learn it. There's an accident in its delivery and in its, in taking the risk of making it. And so it becomes evident to you. Now, inside this dress, this actually is taken in the room next door where my dad is, because I told you that I'm staying with my dad. I'm in his study that has become my bedroom school, and he has a larger space where he self-isolates, and then another room for his bedroom. And so this is actually before the lockdown, and I've using my dad here as a mannequin because I didn't have a mannequin dummy to use. So I said to him, will you just put your hand in the air and will you just put this tube, this almost like it's a tube, a bit like a duvet or a pillowcase. You can get into it, but you can't get out of it. And I put it onto his body just to figure out what is the front and what is the back. Where do the details look best on a body shape? And it allows me to get a sense of gravity, letting fabric flop down. Now, my dad at this time doesn't know what the hell's going on because he's inside a red tube, probably thinking he's being reborn, but he's not in it for long. And the next thing that follows is that I then cut a hole for the head. Now at this point, my dad's not in the garment. He's now, this is actually on a mannequin dummy. And I'm beginning to think, what is the first incision that I make? And the first incision will be a cut for the head hole. A bit like if you make a poncho, if you cut a hole into a piece of cloth and you put it over your head, it becomes a garment, it's a poncho. So here, the first incision will allow the garment to drop down onto the shoulders. Here it is dropping down onto my shoulders. The next thing is that I will then cut 2 holes for the arm to allow my arms to escape by figuring out where does it feel best on the body, how does it balance on the body, but also then fitting it onto Andrew to make sure that it fits his body, because this garment isn't made for me. From the back, it looks quite historic, and maybe the colour red, it makes it look a little bit like, I don't know, it has a slightly religious connotations to it. It looks a little bit perhaps even Roman Catholic. From the front, it's very abstract and maybe avant-garde and strange in its construction. But this front is made from Andrew's body. You know, all of this garment is, in fact, all the way around it, 360 degrees, is formed from a hole that is in the shape of his body. So it's a portrait of his physical form. And here he is in it as I then test it on his body, as I fit it and get it right to be worn. And of course, this garment isn't made as a garment. He didn't ask me to make him a garment. He asked me to make him a video. And that video was for a piece of his music. So what follows next is I take him back to the beach that when I was at college making a video of some suits that my brother wore, that I then needed a piece of music for, and then I decided to write to Andrew and ask him whether I could use his music. I was recording it on this beach here in a place called Worthing. So I took Andrew back to that beach 20 years later to sort of like make a circular journey back to where our relationship started from. And here he is. There's usually a tide that covers this beach. So usually this is the absence of the tide. So there's an hour where the tide goes out and it's far away and it releases this space, this land. And there's also the sun going down. So the sun is setting. And so we had about an hour of time before the tide comes in and the sun goes, so there's no light. And we shoot a video in that time. And the video is simply Andrew wearing the garment and responding to it in some way, fidgeting in it, moving around. When you put garments on, you always move in strange ways. And it's really interesting to observe those movements and then, in this case, to set it back to music. So this is a little sort of snippet of Andrew in the garment. This is the end piece made that's then been set back to his music.
I'm singing while the hunting horns blow. I'm singing while the hunting horns blow. There's a lot of huffing, puffing. There's something at the door. There's something at the window.
So that garment is really just a portrait garment of a person who's a musician with all the measures made according to or relating to music, and then taking it on a journey to being worn, and then just observing how somebody moves and then setting it back to music. And music is just really something that's quite important to our kind of collaboration together.
Yeah, so this was in Huddersfield, University of Huddersfield in February, and we had a masterclass, subtraction masterclass for 2 days, and all the students had their own responses, and they made their own dresses, and then they dressed up and played around in them. And also there were 2 people there that were very interesting to collaborate with. One of them was a musician, and the other one was a filmmaker. So they were partners and they came to collaborate with us. So they kind of sampled and recorded the sounds of cutting and sewing, knitting. So they had all the sounds that create garments, and then they sang it and added beats and sounds. So that was playing in the background, and also the film was kind of made along with the sound. So it came together as like a performance piece. So everyone was just moving around and performing their own dresses.
Very interesting to sort of consider the connections to music and sound.
Yeah.
and how it affects the shape of garments that we make. This is Marie and I, the very last garment we made together in Singapore before the lockdown. So on the 16th of March this year, we were both in Singapore doing a masterclass. And every garment we make is usually named after the person it's made for. So in this instance, it's called Marie Singer 2 because it's the second time that we've done a class in Singapore together. And Marie's wearing a mask because we had to teach wearing masks at the time because that's part of the law there. And because they were much more sort of stringent on the activities, much more so than they are here. And this garment is like a test garment so that people can kind of like then make their own version. But what happened is that we made this garment, and then in the evening we then were listening to the news or looking at the news online, and we suddenly realised that Marie's country, Georgia, were closing its borders very quickly. And so we then had to pay for Marie to have an evacuation flight back to Georgia very quickly and change our plans so that she could return home, so she didn't get locked out of her country, which was a kind of concern. And then I had to then continue doing these well, I call them crazy legs and crazy sleeves. We did a series of drawing with the students, and then they get to make some very simple tubes that you can put on your arms and on your legs. They're just made from rectangles with holes in it, pairs of holes that join together. And then if you put your leg or your arm in it, they create all these wonderful, strange shapes. And you never really know what they're going to be or what they're going to look like. You have to sort of experiment. And when you put an arm in it, an arm never stays straight. An arm always bends. And if you put a leg in it, a leg is always bending and moving, and they're asymmetrical. They're not, the left and right aren't always the same. So you can really wriggle around in them. And if you take pictures as you go, you can create some very intriguing new ideas for trousers and for arms. You can even stick your head in it and it can become a very interesting collar. But all it's made from is a very simple tube. And after having made these with the students, I then had to get quickly back to the UK so that I could then, I literally arrived here and my dad's converted his study into a bedroom. And then on the following Monday, I was teaching the Royal College of Art, where I teach graduate diploma, and a course called Graduate Diploma. And we had to get straight back into, the sort of like teaching here, but in a sort of lockdown situation that was very different and very changed, as you all have experienced by having to suddenly be away from your college, your teachers, and also each other. So this little project here is called Body Language, and we're going to just, it's kind of like a little practical thing that you can try out for yourself. So if you want to have a little go at a very quick way of making shape, this doesn't really require much materiality. You don't have to have a lot of things to make it. You can explore it with an A4 piece of paper if you want. I teach it sometimes to artists and sculptors and product designers and architects, and it can be explored in different kinds of ways. And it's just a way of making a sculptural form, and then if you photograph it and draw it, that might then give you ideas for further designs. But it's about making shapes that you can't predict. So it starts by, and this is something I'd like you all to do as a sort of task, and you don't have to do all of it immediately, but it's something you can begin to think about now. And that is that I want you to think of 10 words that mean something to you, that matter to you, words that resonate in some way. It might be the name of somebody you love. It might be somebody who you feel close to, that you really admire and respect. It might be somebody that you miss, somebody you can't be with, somebody who you're separated from because of the lockdown. It might be somebody who's passed, who's no longer with us. It could be, that we want to honour them in some way. But names are really important and resonate a lot. It might also be places. There might be places that we are really sort of nostalgic about. There may be places we were born in, places that we want to return to, places that we want to reconnect with. So it could be a place name. Or it could just be a feeling or a memory or anything, in fact, that you stand for that matters to you. It could also be something you stand against. Like it could be something that you feel horrified about, something that you absolutely livid about, that you want to sort of like say, this is a word that I have to say is important to me right now today. So whether it's a positive or a negative, it's something that echoes and resonates with you. And if you make a list of 10 things, then each of your lists will be very uniquely different to you. And you can do it in your own language. It doesn't have to be in sort of like English language. It doesn't have to be in a Western Roman font. It can be in a graffiti-like handwriting, a calligraphy. It can be in any language that you wish. And we teach this all around the world, and people do it in very unlikely things and you know, very unique things to themselves. So here's the work of Victor and Rolf. You know, the use of language within a garment has been explored quite interestingly by different kinds of people. And Victor and Rolf do it in a very super technical way, trying to incorporate language into their garments. Also in the middle is the work of Yuri Pardi, who's a Brazilian designer who trained in East London, who makes very architectural shapes and forms. So the language you use doesn't have to be a language as in it's just about words. It could be a pictorial language, it could be a symbolic language, it could be a picture of something or an emoji that signifies that word or that shape or that form. You could also think about how your own body can create shapes and forms, like the letter H at the bottom that's contorted into shape there. A little bit more work by Victor and Rolf, because they've used language a lot in their garments to sort of signify or signal to their audience certain beliefs and thoughts. There's the work of Fengchen Wang, who has the word you written sort of in three-dimensional letters into the garment. There's a flower arrangement that's often used in a funeral to signify a certain, respect for a certain character or word or letter or name. And then over on the far left-hand side, there's the t-shirt issue, a wolf that's been incorporated into the garment. So maybe it's a symbol or a picture that you want to show rather than a word. It's your choice, but your 10 words or your 10 symbols must be meaningful in some way. So this is the work of Holly McQuillan. She's a zero waste cutter, and zero waste is about not wasting any scrap of cloth. So she's taken the word war and the word peace, and then she's constructed these two garments below. And if you look at it like a jigsaw puzzle, there's not a gap between anything, and every part becomes used. And so it's quite an intriguing way of working. With Holly, she's one of my favourite cutters in the world. She's got a very good Instagram called Holly McQuillan, which you might want to look at, and she's doing some great work currently in Sweden where she's doing her doctorate. She has, this is the word peace, that's, you know, it's quite abstract, and when she's creating it, she doesn't, when she first would have started out, she wouldn't have known what the word peace would look like when it's actually put onto the body and there's limbs in it and we move at certain angles. All of that, those are unknowns, but she still persists in trying to use every part and every scrap of the cloth. And she also makes these very interesting wooden tools on the left-hand side that are used to cut and to slice neck holes, armholes, hems for different sizes. So she's making her own tools, and those tools then allow her to make zero waste garments, because when you make zero waste, a single cut is very useful for allowing an opening into the garment. So you might consider how you might make your own tools. They're actually based upon ideas such as kirigami. Origami is the folding of a material. Kirigami is the cutting of a material. And it's used in various scientific fields, not just in art fields. It's used to design solar arrays, biomechanical devices, and micro and nano electromechanical systems. So it's not just an art field, an art construction. It's a construction that it can be used at varying from tiny scale to massive scale in science too. And if you look at the blue columns, the shape in the blue columns, this is the aerial view of what it looks like. And then if you make a cut into it, like a crisscross cut, and then you apply gravity to it, it shapes into these forms. If you take a circular cut and then you put a couple of circles around it that are sliced, it begins to create this sort of shape and form. And so just by using gravity and slicing alone, you begin to create three-dimensional shape. Now, in the spaces we're in now, we might have different access to different materials and different tools, and it's variable depending on where you are and what you've got at hand. So if you make a slice and you want to join an edge, then you might be able to machine stitch that edge if you have a machine. If not, you might need to get a needle and thread and hand stitch it. Or if you haven't got that, then you might need to pin it. If you haven't got that, then you might need to staple it. If you can't staple it, then maybe you have to sellotape it or masking tape it or gaffer tape it together or glue it. And if you've got none of those things, then maybe you have to use just gravity alone and the materiality to just slot it in place and let it hold itself long enough to observe it, to photograph it, to look around it, and also to see how the shadow of light plays on it. So that you can then, once you make a picture of it, you can then draw it, sketch it quickly, and then see how that sketch can perhaps be transferred into something product-like, something that's actually part of a creative activity of something you might wish to to make. It might be a garment, it could be a sculptural form, but it's the beginning of a process of ideas. If you're using paper to make words, then they might get destroyed during the wearing of those words. So they might get torn up, they might get ripped. And maybe if you're making a word that you want to destroy, if it's a word that you stand against and you wish to rip it up, then the performance of that might be important. So try and consider all of these things when you're actually documenting the thing that you're making, the word becoming three-dimensional. To make a three-dimensional word is a simple series of cuts, and here with like a sort of Roman English, sort of Roman Western font, it's just a couple of cuts and a fold, and you suddenly have every letter of the alphabet. You could do this though with any language, any scripture, any calligraphy, any handwriting, depending on what language you wish to speak in or what symbol you wish to communicate. You can also use your own body if you haven't got materials, and maybe you put yourselves into a sort of a yoga of kind of letter shapes. If you take a dimension around the periphery of a letter and you add in a dimension, then it immediately becomes three-dimensional, the more so depending on how stiff the material is. If it's soft, it will just collapse in a maybe intriguing way. It's maybe worth testing and observing that. If you don't have materials at all, like sometimes we've been teaching this in certain places around the world where people have very limited resources, and we have to be much more thoughtful of how we use things to communicate words and language. So maybe we use our furniture, we use our clothes, we use our trash, we use our hair, we use our bodies, we use everything. Whatever we want to spell out, if the word means something to you, then find a way to spell it out, find a way to communicate it. And as I said, you can use your body to do that. But if you say constructing a garment, you may construct a garment for more than one person. Maybe it's a participatory event. Maybe in this time of social distancing where we can't be together close, we maybe have to make a garment that has an absence within it. Maybe one day you might join together with your friend or partner or lover or whoever it is that you wish, and you'll be within that garment once more. Maybe you make it for your whole group. Maybe you make a class version where you're all going to be in it one day. It's a performance that brings you back together in celebration of your return. But maybe you haven't got all the materials to do that. So if you can't do it full scale, maybe you have to make a mini version, a miniaturized version. Or if you haven't got the materials, you have to draw it, design it, imagine it. So nothing really stops you in these activities. The only things that really stop us is feeling that we don't know what to do. What do we do in this situation that we now find ourselves? And all of these little activities are just giving you ideas of things that perhaps might be useful to try out. You never know unless you try. This is the work of Gabi Schillig. She's a German architect who is a professor in Düsseldorf, and she creates soft form portable architectural plans that she creates. They're full buildings, but they're miniaturized, and she then gets within them and she performs within them and occupies them, and she takes them to landscapes to set against building backdrops to reconnect them to the idea of architecture. And she also sometimes uses subtraction cutting too. This is the work of Pierre Kaufmann, who mimics buildings. So if there's a place in the world that you miss, then maybe become that garment, bring it to you. What you can't be with, we must somehow find a way to reunite ourselves with. So perhaps there's an aspect of a building or a place that you can bring into yourself, that you can mimic. The work of, punks and beatniks and hippies often would make what we call DIY, do it yourself, very fast made signals and use language to sort of signal what they feel, what they stand for, what they stand against. And so it might be what band you're interested in, or it might be something that you want to sort of like trash or comment against, in a disestablishment way. Or it might just be some funny, strange comment that you want to say to piss somebody off. Or it might, on the other hand, say the top left-hand corner, be something that is made slowly over time, so that gently, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, this garment evolves some kind of history through layering that changes it. So the pace at which you want to work, if you want to make an immediate statement, or if you want to make something that is very slowly evolving, work in the pace that feels good to you right now. Don't feel anxious or worried that all of this has to happen immediately. Just take bits of it and see how slowly something could change. You might just do a little bit of work on something, little bit each day, over many months or even a year, and then eventually you'll see the outcome. Or you might very fast do it, like this sort of punk piece here, where it's just like rolled off very quickly and it's just there, done, bang, move on to the next thing. This is the work of Heather Hansen that, you know, Marie and I are very intrigued with. Maybe Marie would say something about Heather.
Yeah, so she's visual artist, and she's American, but she also studied dance, and she's also within being a visual artist, she also is a dancer, which very much is shown in her work. So she does this very big scale body drawings, and she uses inks and charcoals and different mediums to kind of do a very big reach. Drawings are very kind of reactive and experimental and intuitive. So you know, every drawing is different, but they all show her movements and her physical activities, I guess, in them, and they somehow also represent garment patterns in their scale.
If you look at where she's actually sat on the bottom right hand side, if you were to make a little hole where she was sat and you were to put your head through it, and then you were to cut around the outer edge of this shape, you'd end up with a kimono. And that kimono would be made from her outward reach, the movement of her body, which is different from day to day. You know, sometimes you wake up and you're stiff and achy and you can reach far. Other days you're nice and subtle and you can, you know, move around. So our movements are always changing. And it's really interesting to find ways to document that. You might not have as much paper as this. You might need to draw it onto fabric. Or if you can't have a space to work in this big and you don't have the fabric to work on or the materials, then just do it with get a piece of paper and just see what your hand can do. What can your arm do? If you attach a pen to your leg, what can your leg draw? And all of these are coming from the human body, but they're very intriguing lines to work with when making garments, because garments are made for people that move, and we often forget that. We often make them for mannequin dummies, which don't move, and they don't have heads or arms or legs or opinions. This is the work of Echo Morgan, whose Chinese name is Zi Wong, and the work of Donna Huanca, both of which use their bodies as canvases to draw and paint onto, or to paint with. And so here's Echo actually using her hair as a paintbrush to paint a painting with, and also her body to paint onto. And Donna Huanca had some really beautiful colour work that she creates these lovely, really intriguing compositions that have people, performances, sculptural objects, as well as paintings, all within a particular space. And so if you haven't got fabric to work on, then use your body. We all have bodies, and we forget we have them quite often when we're designing. And it's super important as designers that we start to consider our bodies in relation to the things that we're making. Don't feel disconnected from the garments you make. Become part of it. Become the tool that helped made it. So here's something for you to try out. Okay, so when I start thinking about hand stitching, I'll always practice it. I'll make a little sort of palette of what I call stitch palette. And a bit like if you were mixing paint and you're trying to slowly mix paints together, I do the same with stitching. I'll just make stitch, 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 stitch. And what I discover in that process is that they're not all equal. They're all slightly imperfect. But that imperfection is what makes hand stitching most beautiful. So this is a little stitch palette of just trying out different stitches. And some of them sort of might maybe connect to some sort of tailoring stitches that I learned when I was at college, and I haven't practiced in some time, but my hand remembers them, so I go back to them initially. And I'm trying out different types of yarns and different techniques of applique, and I'm just stitching stuff down, stuff I find around. It might be just bits and pieces, waste materials I have available. And in this instance, they're made not to make a garment, but to make a banner, something that says something that signals to somebody else a message, something positive, yes, something three-dimensional, but in something soft, it's going to collapse a bit. But this is just practicing through stitching. If you were to take a piece of fabric and we're going to hand stitch it together, not machine stitch it, because hand stitching is far more beautiful. And you can do this in paper, you could do it in fabric, you can do it in whatever materials you have, and join it whatever way you can. This here is 1.5 meters of orange cloth. It's a cotton, and it's got drawn into it the word love. And also it has the bits that aren't love. So these are the bits that aren't love. So maybe they're the opposite of love. Maybe what's the opposite of love? Is it hate? I'm not sure. This is love. These are the bits that aren't love. But I'm going to use every part So if I was to say take the letter E, the top edge of the letter E, and I join it to the downward diagonal of the V, and then I start to join in the inside of the O, and I just move from piece to piece, from letter to letter, from waist piece to waist piece, and I join them together in whatever order you like, intuitively, without knowing what they're going to look like. They begin to shape and form into something three-dimensional. And if you have a hole, that allows an arm or a head or a part of the body, a leg or a limb, to pass through it. If you like, you can add pleats as you go along. There are no rules. You just do what you think is right. And here it forms into a lovely piece that's formed around my own body. And by being in orange cloth, it's got a slight feeling of some sort of Buddhist robe to it. It's a garment that I had no idea would ever take shape into this particular garment-like forms that coming from the word love. So then I take the word hate and I make it in a piece of calico. I don't really like calico very much. I don't know whether I'd go so far to say I hate calico, but calico is not a material I very much enjoy using. A lot of people use calico for prototyping and toiling of shapes, and they do so without much thought and consideration. They think, oh, that's what I have to do, I have to prototype in. But often prototyping is made in this material even when the end material is nothing like calico. So I always think you should, instead of using calico to toile on prototyping, you should use a material that is a waste material, something that's not needed or not loved, and maybe has a property to it that is similar to the end garment you hope to make. And in this example, I used the word hate, and because it was the opposite of love, I thought, what would be the difference between love and hate? So I cut it out of about 1.5 meters of calico, and this is the word hate. These are the bits that aren't hate, so maybe the opposite of hate. So maybe this is love. I don't know what's the opposite of hate. And this is the letters hate. These are the bits that aren't hate. But you use every part of it, and you maybe take the top of the T, and you start to join it into this upward bit of the A, and you go around this corner here. And then you maybe take this bit in the top of the H, and you begin to join it on somewhere. And slowly, bit by bit, you use every single piece. And eventually it joins into something three-dimensional, which you can put on the body, and you can begin to learn it as a garment shape. And it begins to make these strange shapes and forms that you would never have known had you not, tried out putting a word of importance to you into cloth. My boss at the Royal College of Art where I work is called Gary, and I wondered what would happen if I took Gary's name and put it into cloth. So this is Gary. These are actually the bits that aren't Gary. This is the words that are Gary. And it's uppercase and lowercase, and these aren't measured letters. They're just very quickly graffitied on. And I use his name and the bits that aren't his name all together to make a coat. And it's strange that the word Gary becomes a coat. Who would have thought that that might be possible? I certainly wouldn't have known at the time. Then, after I came back from Singapore, I had to actually do a workshop with students where I actually had to show them this technique and explain it to them. So at this time, I took a word that was most important to me, and that is the word Marie. And so I took Marie's name, something that I wanted to sort of think about as I hand-stitched it and as I meditated upon this shape and form. I turned the letter I upside down into an exclamation mark, and it became the word Marie, all the bits that aren't Marie, the waist parts, and I use every single bit of it to create this garment here, and it hangs on my wall next to me. And it's the Marie garment. It was the very first thing I made after lockdown that sort of like reflected on the idea of a shape and form made from something that is important to me right now. And when I made that garment, I then put it on my body. And it made me feel a little bit like a tortoise or a snail within a shell. I wanted to kind of like hide a bit, because at this time I was on Zoom a lot. I was suddenly doing lots of online classes, and I kind of wanted to hide from the camera a little bit. So when I'm doing this class, I'm kind of putting it on, but I'm also wanting to hide a bit. And that kind of was how I felt when I put that garment on. So when you put it on, it might well change how you feel about yourself, and might therefore change the way you wear it and your relationship to it. This is a class that I've done with wonderful students at the Royal College of Art, where I teach the graduate diploma course, and they've taken this technique and used it in very intriguing ways. This was before the lockdown, where they were able to work on each other's bodies, so that instead of using mannequin dummies, they'd actually make the garment on each other. And so that's a very lovely collaborative activity, 2 garments being made at one time by 2 people who are working together. And it could work now if we had, if we use a little bit of distance and maybe some masks, it could potentially work as the ability of us to coming together, loosens as lockdowns begin to ease. In this one also, you could do it on yourself if you don't have a partner to work with. But there are lots of very important words that resonated with the students at that time. And what I also liked was that some students made it in non-conventional materials, so maybe it's made in paper, and here it is on my face, a word made from Chinese characters that is made into more like an accessory jewel, like maybe it's a piece of jewelry, maybe it's a hat, maybe it's a piece of makeup that forms around the face and the features of it. So you can use whatever materials you have available and work on whatever part of the body you like. But the most important thing is to make something that resonates with you. So what words matter to you in your practice and in your lives that are different to each other, and can you find a way to make that words in material into something that you can hold, that you can position around your body, and that you can make into something that can maybe inspire a new way of kind of like working and practicing. And that kind of brings us to the end of this session. These sessions tend to sort of actually come to a fairly abrupt halt, because I say lots and lots and lots of things, and then I like to just leave you with the aftermath of this work. And I hope that it will be useful to you at some point in just considering how you yourselves can approach this in your own unique ways with whatever materials you have at hand. I'm going to stop the recording part of this now, because if I can find the button for that,